Thieaudio have recently released new versions of 2 of their most popular IEMs, so we now have the Monarch Mk3 and the Prestige Limited, and so I've tested them against each other, also their predecessors, and then the Sennheiser IE900 as a direct competitor to see which IEM of this group is now the best choice for your money. Straight away I'm going to tell you that both IEMs are potentially worthy updates to their predecessors, but there's also a bit of a surprise in how Thieaudio have approached the tuning of these. Kicking things off with an introduction, and first up we've got the Monarch Mk3. This now comes in at the same price as the old one at $999 US, and for that money you're getting this lovely acrylic design shell. It's what I often refer to as the sort of pseudo custom design, where it's moulded to approximate the shape of most people's ears, and then of course you've got your nozzle for changing the tips over. And this time around there's a slightly different faceplate compared to the original Monarch. Whether it's better or worse, I'll leave that up to you. And then on the inside of each of these, we've got some different drivers going on compared to the old one. We've got a single electrostatic driver, 3 balanced armatures, and then a new dual dynamic bass system called Impact 2. Essentially what that means is you've got 2 dynamic drivers firing into the same chamber, what's called an isobaric setup, and that's intended to produce even better bass from the Monarch Mk3 compared to the Monarch Mk2. Interestingly enough, if that's a better system, I'm not sure why they haven't included that in the Prestige Limited, as we'll talk about in a moment, but that's what the marketing from Thieaudio says, so that's what we're going to have to go with for now. For those of you wondering, the differences in terms of driver count between the Mk3 and the Mk2 is actually less. So the Mk3 version has 1 less balanced armature, although kind of technically it's got an extra driver in the dynamics, but they are operating, those 2 dynamics are operating as a single driver. Now driver count doesn't actually mean anything, it's all about how well they work together and how well they're tuned, and so we'll get to that shortly. Before we get to that though, it's worth noting that this is a 4-way design for those that care. So with that combination of electrostatics, dynamic drivers and balanced armatures, you've got a 4-way crossover design, breaking that down into your bass, your mid-range, your sort of upper mid-range, lower treble and treble. So that means there's a 4-way crossover going on in here, and the end result of those drivers and that crossover is an impedance of just 18 ohms and sensitivity of 99 decibels per milliwatt. So it's both a lower impedance and a lower sensitivity than the Mark II, but in this case it doesn't really matter because both are pretty easy to drive. One other very key and obvious change with the Monarch Mk3 is that gone is the old cloth wrap cable, and now we've got the same cable as was on the original Prestige and also on the Prestige Limited. And that's great. I think this is a really lovely, beautiful feeling cable. It sits well, it works well. You've got the interchangeable plug system, so you can very quickly and easily change between 2.5, 3.5 and 4.4mm. And so it's a really good cable and accessory package. You've got good tips, a little case, everything you really need. And with that said, let's look at the Prestige Limited. And in the case of the Prestige Limited, the first thing I'll mention is that it's kind of hard to tell apart the Prestige Limited from the Prestige. They've got very, very similar faceplates from the original to the Limited version. They are different, but at a glance, they're not far enough different that you can tell. So if you do have a reason to collect both, be aware that it is a little bit hard to tell which is which at first. From there, we've got the exact same driver setup in the Prestige Limited that the original Prestige did, but according to the marketing, they're updated versions of some of those drivers. And so in the case of the Prestige Limited, we've got 4 electrostatics, 4 balanced armatures, and just a single dynamic driver. So as I said before, they're not using the Impact 2 system in the Prestige Limited that they're using in the Monarch Mk3, and instead our driver count is higher in terms of the electrostatics and the balanced armatures. Now whether that means anything sonically, we'll work that out soon. With all those drivers, the Prestige is a 5-way design. Now that's again neither here nor there. It's not about the number of crossover points, it's about how well they all mesh together. And the end result of all of that is a 22 ohm, 98 decibel sensitivity IEM. So in this case, it's a higher impedance and a higher sensitivity than the original Prestige. But once again, that's kind of irrelevant because they're all very easy to drive. As I've already mentioned, it's the same cable here as on the original Prestige. And again, the same accessory package as you get from the Monarch Mk3. And so there's not a lot more to say. They're comfortable IEMs. I think they look great. They look premium. They feel good in the ears. The accessory package is quite good, although I still personally choose to use other tips because I really like things like the Final Audio E-Type. But other than that, what you get for your money in terms of looks, feel, quality, etc. is spot on. And that means it all comes down to how they sound. I thought the best way to go through the process of telling you how they sound was to start off comparing them to their old predecessors. So is the Mark III an upgrade from the Mark II? Is the Prestige Limited an upgrade from the Prestige? And then we'll talk about how these two compare to each other, And then finally to the Sennheiser IE900, which for me is kind of an ongoing champion in the space at around about that $1,200 mark. But to kick things off, I put the Monarch Mk3 up against the Monarch Mk2, and one of the tracks I used was Magnetar by Mark Lettieri. This is a track that was selected and suggested by one of my channel patrons. So members of Patreon at the Passion and above level get access to a playlist where they can share with me their suggestions for test tracks. And if I enjoy them and I like them, I'll use them in videos like this one. And so listening to Magnetar, starting off with the Mark II, it sounded fantastic. Oh, and by the way, all testing was done with the Chord Mojo 2 with the Chord Poly as the transport. Starting off with the Monarch Mk2, and the sound from those was punchy and clean and very, very enjoyable. Separation and imaging was strong, and the sense of attack and transient energy from the Monarch Mk2 was excellent. There was a good sense of energy without any harshness or aggression. Switching over to the Monarch Mk3, and the sound got immediately crisper. The Monarch Mk3 is a less sensitive IEM, and so listening at the exact same volume level on the device, being the Mojo 2, there should have been slightly less output in terms of total sound pressure level, and yet I felt like I wanted to turn the volume down a little bit going to the Monarch Mk3, because it was a bit crisper and a bit more energetic in the top end. Or actually, as the case may be, because there's a little bit less bass, and therefore it doesn't balance the treble in quite the same way. Having said that, that's not to suggest that the Monarch Mk3 was bad, because the benefit of that tuning was that it also raised the sense of clarity, the sense of image focus, and the general sense of transparency of the IEM. There's less warmth through the mid-range of the Mark III, for better or worse, and the deep bass is still present from the Mark III, not quite to the same degree that it was from the Mark II, and so the end result is that you get a sound from the Mark III that is a little bit more mid-range and treble focused, but both are excellent sounding tunings. One area that I do think the Mark III is a clear step forward is in spatial information. The sense of staging, the sense of positioning and imaging, and the separation of sounds is all stronger and clearer from the Mark III. From that sort of technical point of view, I do think it's a stronger IEM. From a tuning point of view, some are going to love the Monarch Mk2 more than the Mark III. The Monarch Mk2 is probably technically a more balanced tonality of an IEM, but having said that, the tuning of the Mark III is done so well that I think in some ways it's actually the better sounding IEM as well, and I like a warmer, richer sound, but the Monarch Mk2 just has that technical edge that brings me more and more into the music. And so at this point, I'd say that unless you specifically want a slightly richer, warmer sound, the Mark III is a better choice than the Mark II. If you've got the Mark II and you want that next step in technicalities, the Mark III is a lovely upgrade. Having said that, if you've got the Mark II and you don't want any more technicalities, you don't want any extra clarity, brightness in the treble, energy in the treble in the top end, then the Mark III is probably not your best choice. And this is going to get us into what's very interesting about these two IEMs in just a moment. I'm not going to give it away just yet, but there's a very interesting decision that's been made by Thieaudio here, and not necessarily one that I agree with. We will get to that in a moment, but before we do, let's talk about the Prestige Limited and the original Prestige. Moving over now and starting off with the original Prestige, and listening to Stranger by Chihiro Yamanaka, the original Prestige once again sounds wonderful. There's some great cymbal work in this track, and it's clean and textured, but not overdone or over-enhanced by the original Prestige. The piano has a nice sense of resonance and percussiveness, and the double bass in this track has a good sense of body and texture from the originals. I felt like the staging from the original Prestige was very good, but perhaps a little bit left-right. I don't know this track particularly well. It's one that I've got in what I call my Discovery playlist. It's an album that I'm still getting used to, but it did feel to me like there should have been just a little bit more sense of maybe depth or separation in the sound for a perfect rendition. That said, it still sounded wonderful. I was kind of picking hairs at this point and looking for things that I hoped the Prestige Limited would do better, and that was one area that I did hope to hear more. Going over to the Prestige Limited, and the first thing I noticed again was those cymbals, because this time there was a little bit of extra texture added to them compared to the original Prestige. The separation and imaging from the Limited was also cranked up a notch from the original Prestige. And so now what I was finding was that the piano in this track was really kind of holding its own space. Before it was kind of bleeding across the stage a bit, and you could sort of hear where it overlapped with the drums and also with the double bass. Whereas now I felt like it had its very own place, the double bass had its own place, and the drums had their own place. And so that goes back to what I said before, that the original Prestige didn't give me quite the same sense of staging that the Prestige Limited can actually deliver. So this track did have more to give, and the Prestige Limited are delivering. Thinking about the overall tonality of the sound, and I don't think there's as much of a shift in tonality going from the original Prestige to the Limited as there was going from the Monarch Mk2 to the Monarch Mk3. In the case of the Mark II and Mark III Monarchs, there was a shift from being a slightly warmer tuning to kind of a clean, neutral and clarity focused tuning. In fact, it goes beyond neutral, I think, because it's really emphasizing the mid-range and the upper end a little bit. Whereas I feel like in the Prestige, it's like they've taken the original Prestige tuning and just refined it and improved on it. So the general character remains the same, they've just tweaked it a little bit. And that means that if you've got the original Prestige and you love it and you just want it even better, that's where the Limited comes in. But if you've got the original Prestige and you want something different, there's really no point buying the Limited from a tonality point of view. It's a technical improvement on the existing tonality. And so we've got, in my opinion, two improved versions of the existing IEMs from Thieaudio, but this is kind of where the catch comes in. And that is that what Thieaudio have now done is produce two IEMs in the Monarch Mk3 and the Prestige Limited that measure almost the same, and therefore from a tonal perspective are almost the same IEM. And so that raises a couple of questions. The first question for me is, why did they do this when it basically means that people are going to choose one or the other? There's no reason, in my opinion, that you'd ever want to have both. I think that's a bit of a shame. It would have been really nice to see the Monarch Mk3 maintain that slightly warmer, richer sounding tuning, so that for those of you that want a couple of IEMs with different sounds for different moods or genres, you could choose that. Whereas what Thieaudio have essentially done is said, choose this one or choose this one because they sound the same, tonality-wise. Because then the other question that it raises is, which one's actually doing that tuning better? Is the Prestige Limited actually worth more money? Is it technically superior to the Monarch Mk3? Or is it just a different set of drivers delivering the same exact sound? And so that was the next step, was to put these two up against one another for some very critical listening to see which one came out on top. Listening to Get Close by the Rolling Stones, and the first thing that I'd say is that the tonality was exactly as you'd expect. And that is to say, very, very similar between these two. Where things got a bit different though, was in the sense of refinement. The Prestige Limited delivers everything with just a little bit more sense of control. Sounds like the vocals, the cymbals and the drums all had a bit more refinement from the Prestige Limited than they did from the Monarch Mk3. It's not to say the Monarch Mk3 sounded bad, but you could definitely hear that there was a greater sense of control and refinement going to the higher priced model. I also felt like the staging was subtly different as well. There's a little bit more depth from the Prestige Limited, and what that meant was that Mick Jagger's vocals were coming from just a little bit further away from me with the Prestige Limited, and there was a bit more sense of space around his vocals as well. As I listened really closely to these two, I feel like the Prestige Limited is tuned just a hair brighter than the Monarch Mk3. It's very, very close. But for those of you that are looking at both of these and wanting to choose between them, the two areas that I would split them is that the Monarch Mk3 is just a little bit warmer, so if you do like a slightly warmer sound, that's probably the way to go. But at the same time, the Prestige Limited is just a little bit more refined, and that results in a slightly smoother listen anyway. And so realistically, they are very, very, very close together. I think if you are choosing between the two of them and budget isn't necessarily a strong consideration, I think the Prestige Limited is the way to go. Having said that, if you need to save or want to save $300, the Monarch Mk2 gets very, very close, and then you can also tweak it a little bit with things like swapping out a cable. So in other words, if maybe you've got a pure copper cable at home somewhere that's going to fit this one, that's going to have a slightly smoother sound than the combination silver-plated copper and silver-plated graphene. Or graphene silver-plated, I'm not sure, it's not clear in the marketing. But either way, you can tweak the sound of the Monarchs a little bit if you've already got a cable, but if you're then going to have to go and spend extra on the cable, just go straight for the Prestige Limited if what you're looking for is that extra bit of refinement. Or of course, if you want a warmer, richer sound to start with, then just go for the Monarch Mk2 if you can still pick it up on the Linsol website, or if you can pick one up secondhand. And that's a really good point. I've forgotten to mention at this stage that I need to say a huge thanks to channel sponsor Linsol for sending me both of these. As is always the case, just because Linsol is a channel sponsor, it doesn't mean I'm only going to say good things about these, as you'll see in a moment. And so I want to say a huge thanks to Linsol for sending out these IEMs and also for sponsoring Passion for Sound. And now with that said, let's jump into a comparison between what I think is the best IEM here in the Prestige Limited and what I see as their direct competition in terms of, in my collection at least, and that's the Sennheiser IE900. Now I know there's plenty of other IEMs that I could have compared these to, but I've got to work with what I've got on hand, and the IE900 is my best and closest IEM in terms of the price range. For those not familiar with the IE900, it's a single dynamic driver IEM, so we're putting a single driver here up against a multi-driver IEM in the Prestige Limited. Still listening to Get Close by the Rolling Stones, but I also tried some other tracks too, of course. But thinking specifically about the notes I made for Get Close, The sense of space and coherency in the soundstage was remarkably different going to the IE900 from the Prestige Limited. And that's not necessarily to say that one is clearly better or worse. Some of this is going to come down to preferences. But the IE900 did, to me, sound like it was doing the better overall job from a technical point of view. A single dynamic driver being a single point source for all the sound is often going to handle things like coherency, staging, spatial cues better than a multi-driver IEM. On the other hand, multi-driver IEMs can sometimes bring out more detail than a single dynamic driver can, and so we'll carry on and see which one's the strongest by the end of this comparison. One thing I did notice with the IE900 was that Mick Jagger's vocal seemed a little bit less kind of present from the IE900 compared to the Prestige Limited. And I don't know if it's because maybe the IE900 pushes the soundstage back a little bit, or at least the vocals back a little bit. There is quite a strong upper mid-range cut in the IE900s, and that can sometimes result in a deeper sense of staging, but in this case I think it might have pushed Mick Jagger's vocals a little bit too far away. And so there were things I was really enjoying about both. At this point it was very hard for me to say that I preferred one over the other. There were things that the IE900 was doing better, and things that the Prestige Limited was doing better. And so I kept switching back and forth and back and forth. I tried a whole bunch of different tracks. And what I started to notice between the two was that I feel like the IE900 tonally is the more balanced sounding IEM. It's still not perfect. It's got quite a strong treble emphasis in relation to how everything else is tuned. It's also got quite a strong cut in the upper mid-range before that treble emphasis, so it's not a perfectly tuned IEM. But I felt like it was a bit more balanced across the board and across a whole range of tracks than the Prestige Limited. I also felt like it was handling the very busy passages in music a bit better than the Prestige Limited, and that kind of surprised me. Normally multi-driver IEMs, because each driver is just focused on its frequencies, often they do a better job. But I felt like I was losing some sense of the individual sounds and instruments from the Prestige Limited, whereas the Sennheiser IE900 seemed to always keep it under control and separate all the sounds a bit better. I could pick out individual instruments more cleanly and clearly from the IE900. On the other hand, where the Prestige Limited had its own benefits, was that it's bringing what seems to be a very deliberate sense of emphasis and kind of clarity to the mid-range up into the treble. And that can be really beneficial on certain genres and certain systems and sources and for certain preferences. For example, on a track like Soldier Child by Wilco, I found myself preferring that sort of vocal forward presentation that the Prestige Limited has. It helped me really kind of focus in on the core of this track, which is the vocal. And so in that sense, that's where the Prestige Limited is strong. And so I found myself at the end of this in kind of an enviable position. And why I say that is that I actually think something like the IE900 and the Prestige Limited, or therefore the Monarch Mk3, I think both of them are fantastic IEMs and quite complementary. The IE900 is generally quite a flat tuning with a bit of treble emphasis, whereas the Prestige Limited leans very well into a mid-range and treble focus without losing bass. And so both are quite interchangeable, and one of those things where I'd probably reach for the Prestige Limited for vocal-oriented tracks, particularly simpler tracks where I just want to get into the timbre and the texture of the sound. And then for busier stuff, or where I want a very neutral tuning from top to bottom, that's where the IE900 comes into play. And so both are wonderful, very hard to split between the two, and I'd happily recommend both. And for that matter, therefore, I would also happily recommend the Monarch Mk3, but as I said, I think it's a bit of a shame that Thieaudio have kind of done the same tuning for both. I would have loved to see them choose a different tuning for both of these to give us more choices and more variety. But the benefit for you is that you can save $300 and get almost the same IEM in the Monarch Mk3, in some ways a better IEM if you want that slightly smoother sound. You will trade off a little bit of focus in the image and separation in the soundstage if you do go that way, but for some people that's going to be absolutely worth it. And so again, I think both of these are improved versions of their predecessors from a technical standpoint. I think from a tuning standpoint, you could debate it in the case of the Monarch Mk3. Some will still prefer the Mk2. In the case of the Prestige, it's the same tuning done better in my opinion. And so both are wonderful IEMs and definitely worth considering. And so as always, I'll put links in the description down below. If you like the sound of these, you can go pick them up for yourself using those links. They are affiliate links, and I thank you for any and all support from those that use them. For now though, I hope you found this video useful and helpful and interesting. If you have, please hit the like button and subscribe and ring the notification bell if you haven't already. In the meantime though, until the next video, let me leave with the music. So happy listening, and I'll see you here next time on Passion for Sound.